Welcome everyone to our lecture in The Path to War, Part 6, the final and end of World War II. So we're going to be talking about the Pacific Theater in this second lecture video. And so we're talking about the victory in the Pacific. So obviously it's right there. So let's go ahead and move on. And just to reiterate, so back in the first section, they were discussing kind of the importance of the European theater. And that ends way before, not way before, but it does end before the battle in the Pacific or the war in the Pacific actually ends. Okay. And so that was May 8th, that's today, 1945. And that was the end of the European battle with Hitler, the Germans, and also the Axis powers. All right. So one of the major battles, okay, besides the Battle of Midway, occurred near the end of the Pacific Theater, and this is the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. And then Japan wanted to, again, do that one knockout punch to defeat the Allied fleet. And so this is one of the largest naval battles in modern history. It was just a huge amount of ships versus each other, and it was really off the coast of the Philippines. It was looking to kind of land and actually take over one of the major territories that Japan owned, which was the Philippines. And the Japanese were just overly, they were the underdog. They were greatly outnumbered. They had 17 carriers so the Americans had 17 aircraft carriers to the Japanese 4. And then Americans also had 141 destroyers to, well, the Japanese just 34 destroyers. And so there is no competition here. And the Americans dominate. They are able to take back the Philippines after that, and then amass a pretty large offensive towards Japan from the staging area of the Philippines. And so there's actually some interesting history about, how the Philippines, and there was resistant forces. There were several heroes, like Filipino, heroes that actually kind of made a difference, a pretty big difference in World War II and fighting against the Japanese. And so Iwo Jima is next after that, and Iwo Jima is a crazy, crazy battle. Its island is heavily defended by the Japanese, and the mentality of the Japanese is actually fight till the last man. There is no honor in defeat. There's only honor in death. And so 99% of the Japanese soldier, 99%, that's almost every single Japanese soldier that is actually on the island, decides to fight to the death. And you can see this picture here where you could see a few of these soldiers placing that flag up. I mean, I'm pretty sure the flag and this picture is something that many of you have seen before, but not many of you know where it's from. It's from Iwo Jima. The island is uninhabited. There is nothing on this island except, like during that time, a lot of Japanese, infantry and military, and the casualties are really, really high. The Americans really hurt from this battle. They do win, but it is at a cost of like huge numbers of deaths, like 7,000. That's more than D-Day. That is more than the first landing on D-Day. So imagine how many Americans died. All right, and so the Japanese casualties are super high, and it's actually 21,000 Japanese soldiers die. Um, that's like, sorry, they had 21,000 to start off, and almost 20,000 of that die. 20,784. So that's still a huge number. That's almost all of them. And so when we look at this picture, why is this picture such so ingrained into American culture and into the idea of representing World War II? Because that picture is definitely a very famous picture. So why do you think it's something that we think about when we think about World War II? Okay, so why do you think that Battle of Iwo Jima was chosen to be made into the American Memorial of WW2? Because that's actually the memorial picture. And so consider what was just explained and the statistics and numbers. Consider that for a second. Take a minute, pause. All right, let's talk about the Battle of Okinawa. So Okinawa, despite what people think, okay, is a separate island from Japan. You're like, what? Yeah, it is. It is a separate island from Japan, but it is actually not too far from Japan. So the culture of Okinawa is very, very similar to that of like, a modern day Japan and, like the culture of like, the whole of Japanese. And this is actually supposedly rumored the birthplace of several different martial arts. And it's a very kind of like a rural area, but it was also a very, very, very bloody battle. So the island it's about 350 miles from the main part of Japan. Okay, so that's kind of far, but not too far. And so even the Japanese citizens were fighting to the death for this one. And this is also kind of where I think some of the different battles, even I think Hacksaw Ridge, were actually fought. And so 66,000 soldiers went dead and missing, and even 100,000 civilians that died on this. So it was a very, very like it was one of the like highest casualties, and it was just a huge amount of loss of life for the Japanese. And yet, guess what they said about fighting? Okay, so they were expected to fight to the death. The Japanese or Japan they promised to fight to the death. So they were going to systematically, I guess, eliminate their whole population, even and take as many people down with them in the process. So when FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died in office in World War II, he passed because of his illness. He actually had shoot, not tuberculosis. Well, he was confined to a wheelchair for most of like a good part of his adult life because of a medical condition he had, and eventually that took his life. And so his vice president Truman, okay, took over, and he found out about this project. It's called the Manhattan Project, and it was a secret project about developing the atomic bomb. And Oppenheimer was probably the most important man on that project, and he helped develop this idea of the atomic weapon. So, on the invasion of the mainland of Japan, it was expected. It was rumored that maybe close to 500,000 Allied soldiers would probably perish. And this was a very high number considering that, 7,000, 3,000 was already pretty high in the cases that we already were speaking about for per battle. And so Truman was thinking about, hey, is there an easier way? So Harry Truman was actually this new president. So okay, so actually there was a mistake here. It's actually not President Roosevelt. It's actually President Truman. So if you were, uh, considering this, how would you advise, like President Truman, how to deal with the Japanese and who said they would never surrender? So what would you consider? Because either way, there's going to be a loss of life. There's going to be either a pretty big toll on the Japanese population, or there's going to be a pretty big toll on both sides. So consider this. All right, so you have to think about what happened to Japan and this idea of the atomic era, okay? And this is the only time where these bombs were actually dropped on a civilian population and in the time of war. And so when we think about like what happened, do you drop the bomb or invade? So first of all, Japan promised to fight to the death. I mean, look at some of the recent battles. Iwo Jima was a very, very bloody battle, and yeah, the Japanese lived up to their promise. Okinawa was also another example, and so expectation of loss was going to be very, very high, but the bomb would only kill 100,000 civilians, considering that you also bring cancer and radiation to that part of the world for who knows how long, for untold periods of time. That's not really the actual number. It's probably a little bit higher. So they dropped the bomb, and Japan was warned to surrender. They refused. So August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was bombed, and there was no response. And so another bomb was dropped 3 days later on Nagasaki, and the Japanese could only assume that it was just going to go on like this until a surrender was completed or the total eradication of Japan. So, what would you choose after that? Right? And so, this was a very dark place in American history, and nothing that we are expected to be proud of, but it definitely is something that is a dark part of the history. I mean, we try to justify it. Is it really justifiable? All right, so here's the results. Okay, 90,000 people died instantly. Okay, and then 50,000 more by the end of 1945 due to radiation, cancer, radiation, and then these are horrible ways to die. Very, very horrible ways to die. You can see actually the picture down there. A very, very horrible way to die. There are burns that actually grow into tumors, and eventually it just eats the body. And so the harm of this is great. So this is why we haven't really seen any atomic bombs dropped since. But since we have so many, we still have a lot to be afraid of. Nagasaki also a smaller amount of deaths, but there is actually a very high toll. So there through the ages and through the time period since this has happened, there's been many stories about the results and aftermath, which are gruesome. There's even actually, and actually, I think the best example is actually a children's fable. It's a children's fable about a girl. Her name is Sadako. And Sadako and her thousand cranes is a story about the after effects of the atomic bomb. So Sadako actually has leukemia. She has cancer brought upon because she was born um, after the bomb was dropped, and because she was born, I guess, close to the area where the bomb was dropped, she actually received leukemia, which is a childhood cancer, and eventually she succumbs to it. She dies from it because, well, there's no cure. She decides that, in order to like kind of save herself, be cured of her disease, she needs to fold 1,000 cranes, and she does actually 999 of them. And so it's a children's fable, but it's a very passionate and very but very I say real kind of image of like what happens with this um, this these because the numbers don't matter. It's really about like the pain and suffering that these two cities kind of endured, and is that really worth it? Even if it was like like the estimated cost of 500,000 American soldiers versus the maybe 220,000 here. So you have to make a decision, right? So Japan does surrender. And so VJ Day, okay, victory over Japan is August 15th, 1945, about 5 months after Europe actually stops fighting. And so the official surrender, September 2nd, 1945, comes a few weeks later, and this is actually the end of World War II. All right, so what did you remember from the conclusion of World War II? Give us about three ideas. What ideas actually really come into mind? And so there is so much in World War II that is so important to our history and to what actually happens in the next 80 years. It's actually directly stems or related in many ways to the conclusion of this war. I mean, look how World War One was such a important part to the beginning and even actually the result of the Second War. So take a few minutes and kind of draw and write out your ideas, please. All right, so we're going to be talking about the results of World War Two and just kind of take a look at some of these pictures. So this is the devastation that war brought. And imagine, uh, and let's hope, knock on wood, in your lifetime seeing any of this in person. Okay. And so no one actually can teach you the act of empathy or feeling what these people feel. But I dare you to try, because if you look at this, it's up to your generation and the generation that it comes after to make sure this never happens again, because I don't think we'll survive it. All right, here's some numbers. So, what do you think the prediction and the result of World War II is going to? Well, what do you think it's going to lead to? Okay, so the result of World War II, we already actually have some things in history that tells us like what happens after this. But what do you think will happen? What do you assume will happen? And maybe even predict, is it possible to even have see a World War III? Right? Okay. So take a few minutes, guys, and really kind of think about this question deeply, and like it matters to you, or maybe your life depended on it, right? All right. So the high price of World War II. So the numbers of deaths is still not very clear. A lot of different resources kind of state higher and lower numbers. So 60 million dead is probably an accurate number. I've seen some numbers as high as 70, and that's a lot of deaths. Millions of people are homeless. Like tons of people have their homes destroyed, and there's billions and billions of dollars of damages. So the road recovery is long and slow, but it happens. So Europe is actually in ruins. There's most of this damage was in Europe. It was more difficult to actually do any kind of major damage specifically, obviously, because well, a lot of these places were in different islands. Okay, and plus Japan is more in the sense of conquering than actually destroying, and Europe was majorly destroyed because of constant bombardments and just like how ruthless and cruel that both sides were in making sure that each side lost. And there's so many displaced people. Those that fled couldn't really go back home, and so they were again homeless, or at least just struggling to find a way in a new environment. So the destruction was countless, and you can see just by the numbers that there was so much that happened. And so population in Poland especially, okay, it was devastated. Poland was wrecked. That's more than half their population was decimated if you kind of look at the numbers. And it became a very sorrowful thing. Um, Paris, Rome, and Brussels, okay, was fine. They made it out all right. So, and just look, Rome and Brussels are both like cities in the Axis territories. So that's like Germany and Italy, by the way. So those major cities, were left untampered with. But again, this doesn't really solve the problem of food, water, electricity, jobs, money, and all of this stuff that actually in the wake of World War II. And so feel like very few remained during war to plant food. And so America was really kind of called upon again to kind of deliver relief and food to Europe. And so it was a very nasty thing. Citizens of Berlin, um, and that's in Germany. So 4,000 citizens of Germany were left to die every day in August of 1945. And so relief was really needed. Okay, so there was actually a lot of blame, and there was many countries that went back to monarchies, kings, such as Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway. They all went back to pre-war monarchies and governments that were more in control, more had to like, okay, this is what we need to do. But others found it difficult with even rebuilding their governments, such as Germany and Italy, the two governments that were, under totalitarian dictators, right? And also where most of the blame laid for World War II. France also actually had difficulties because of their split, because of them like kowtowing to the Germans. And so think about this. Why was there's this change in governments, and why did some countries go back to being monarchies? Why or why not? Are you even surprised that this happened? Right? So give your answer right now. Take a few minutes. All right, and think about this. Okay, even communism starts growing. Okay, back after World War II, in France and Italy, rockets, skyrockets. A lot of communists believe that hey, we could do better, we could change things, and then there's also this fear. Also there was an anti-communist like fear that was slowly creeping in because as economies start recovering, we see that like like people are really afraid of communism. Well, that's gonna just overthrow everything. That's gonna change everything again. And so there is this fear of communism growing in not just like a few countries, but many. Okay, especially the fear of about actually what Russia is looking at, and just to kind of lead into that, like China actually does become communist. Okay. And so at the end of this, the Nuremberg trials actually happened. So what are the Nuremberg trials? All right. So the Nuremberg laws were actually anti-Jewish laws that were actually in Germany. Okay. And so after this huge Holocaust of this systematic elimination of the Jews, the world really wants to put somebody behind that. They want to put blame. They want to find justice. So the world struggles how to deal with Germany and the Holocaust, especially. So, an international military tribunal, meaning that a bunch of different countries set up a trial and they set up their judges from different countries. And this is called the Nuremberg trials. And they represent 23 different nations. And they really look at so who is to blame for this genocide of a race of people. Okay. And obviously, the person at the head of this, okay, isn't there to be blamed for it. Okay. So they look at other Nazi leaders, and 12 Nazis, okay, are put to death. And there is even actually, suggestions and rumors that they went out to hunt for more, just to kind of bring them to justice. Okay. In Japan, 2 million lives lost in the war, and also major cities were destroyed like Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Okay, uh, they the Japanese loss of life is pretty big. 2 million is not a small number to laugh at, and that's just their population. And so Japan is actually they lose all their territories, especially like every single territory they owned, whether it's China or the Philippines. And some of these territories they actually held for such a long time, okay, such as Korea. And so Korea kind of is at last, hey, we're able to govern ourselves. And this actually isn't pretty either, because why is there a North and a South? Well, it's because they couldn't agree. So U.S. now occupies Japan, and one of the major generals of World War II, MacArthur, is actually put in to help rebuilding it. So that's an irony, but it is also something that is important. Okay, so MacArthur, looking at like the devastation, like hey, I made this mess. I guess maybe I should help clean it up. And so there is even trials of like Japan's fault and like blame for what happened in this war, and all blame is exonerated from the Emperor Hirohito, and all the blame is put on the general Hideki Tojo. And so Hideki Tojo is actually executed because he actually took full burden and full blame for inciting war on America. And actually, I really think he's also like executed because he failed in his endeavors, not because that he was at fault for them. Okay, and so peace between Japan and America happens, and it's actually a very long and lasting peace. There, 1951, and it isn't just America, but 48 other countries also signed a formal peace treaty. So there's no more armed forces. If you go to Japan, the police officers don't even carry guns. Okay, so imagine that, and their crime rate is actually significantly lower than ours, right? So think about that. So there is no armed forces Japan. They don't actually have a military. They don't actually have rockets. Maybe they have like a basic defense system, but they are not allowed to actually have armed forces or even carry guns for that matter. Okay, and so the U.S. actually is actually under is actually protecting Japan. If Japan is attacked, U.S. will respond and with military force. And so the U.S. did not make Japan pay restitutions like Germany did in World War One, which was genius because now we enjoy, Japanese cars and of course Japanese anime in abundance, and we just can't get enough, right? I drive Japanese. I admit it. Probably should consider getting like a Ford truck eventually, but this is actually something that helps with Japan's economic recovery, and they really recover. Okay, with the end of the war with the United States, Japan and the United States actually became really strong allies, despite Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which barely in the 2000s did Barack Obama kind of somewhat politically kind of pay some sort of what, we're a little bit sorry for that. Okay, so Barack Obama did actually visit Hiroshima during his time, and there is actually this idea of like, okay, well, it was very unfortunate what happened to Japan, and we were the cause of that, but it's only been like 80 years for that kind of like somewhat sympathetic, okay, non-apology. All right, guys. So think about the results of World War II and think about what came out of this and what do you think is going to happen from this. Okay, so Japan, is able to do really well in the 70s and 80s. I mean, electronics. I mean, nobody's actually not heard of a PlayStation or a Sony or any of these things. The devastation of Europe, does that actually ever blow over? Do they recover? I mean, obviously they do, but what is the extent of that? What about Russia? Okay, communism. All of these things could be a result of World War II, but what does that lead to? And to kind of think about that as we kind of go on more and more. Well, this is the end of our lecture number 2. I hope I didn't ramble too much, but there's just so much interesting things about World War II because this is actual real history. Anybody can make up a story, but to really live a story and really to see something happen unfold in front of your eyes, okay, that's actually personal and very unique experiences. Okay, so maybe someday people will be interviewing about what happened in COVID and your experiences with that. So just keep that in mind, and let's pray for our next generation that they don't experience quite the same um, hardships as previous generations. All right, guys, thank you for your time. Hopefully this lecture was helpful, and we will see you back in class.